It's Matt. Let's talk about compute management in Azure Machine Learning Studio. So here I am in my Azure Machine Learning Studio instance, and I've got a number of resources and tabs here. But in the lower left on the sidebar, I've got compute. And this will let me see my compute instances, compute clusters, inference clusters, and any attached compute I might have. Now, this is often an area of confusion, which is why I've written a whole article about all these different things, which will be linked in the description. But typically, when you're running machine learning experiments, you want to use either a compute instance or a compute cluster. Okay? So a compute instance is a low-powered virtual machine that you typically use to power a notebook in Azure's notebooks feature. So I can go into my notebooks and I can have some Python code and I can run it directly on a VM. I also can use a compute instance to just click in and get at an instance of Jupyter Lab, Jupyter Notebook, VS Code, Terminal Notebook, that kind of thing. So I can actually use these things as a full-fledged IDE in the cloud if I wanted to. Okay? So I don't usually recommend compute instances very much. They are attractive when you're kind of starting out, but I find compute clusters to be far more effective unless you're doing a lot of things with notebooks, in which case right now you need to use compute instances. Now, compute clusters, on the other hand, are these groupings of related nodes that you can scale up and down as they need to. So as I'm running an experiment, I say, hey, I want you to use this cluster here or this cluster there, and it's going to dynamically expand the number of running nodes up to a maximum count. And then once it's done with those tasks, it's going to spin them back down, and I only pay for the running nodes. So it actually tends to be more efficient to use a compute cluster than a compute instance. If I want to create a compute instance, I'd go into the Compute Instances tab and click New. And now I'm going to give it a name, and I could call this Sample Compute, and that name looks like it's unique, and that will work. I'm now choosing if I want a CPU or GPU. So if you're doing a lot of deep learning, you might want GPU, but most of the time you're going to be okay with the CPU, especially just starting out. And then you have a number of options available to you here. And I just want to make sure you're taking a look at the cost column here. So this cost will tell us, how much it's going to cost per hour to run this and the number of quota. Take a look at the category and workload types. Azure pushes you towards, a subset of these options, but if you want to take a look at all the options, you can see a lot more. And I will often sort by the cost. And it might be tempting to choose just the lowest cost one by default. That's kind of what I did. But it actually takes a lot longer to run your experiments, and you might actually be paying more to run a low cost instance. So just keep that in mind. So that's some of the considerations we have there for creating a compute instance. Compute clusters are going to be very, very similar. We go in there, we tell it, hey, what location do we want it to be in? And now we're choosing a tier of virtual machine. And there's dedicated and then there's low priority. Dedicated is not going to get interrupted, but low priority might. The difference is that low priority is generally going to be a lot cheaper for you to use. Since I do a lot of my machine learning experiments in the evenings, low priority tends to be what I choose. I can then choose CPU or GPU, and I can now choose, from any one of these options available to me. Now note that there is an available quota. So let's talk a little bit more about the quota in a minute, because that's kind of one of the more complex aspects of Azure. But once you select which tier you want, you come in and you give it a compute name. So I'm going to call this cluster sample. Now you specify the minimum number of nodes. Very important. This should always be 0. If this is above 0, then you're always going to be having an instance running, and you're always going to be paying for it. And that's generally very bad. Depending on what you're running with, you might be able to go more than one nodes. In this case, I'm limited to one node just because of the options I picked and my available quota right now. But you can click create and it'll actually go in and create it. Most of the time I'm running with a node of about 3 or 4 clusters, something like that. So we have these available to us. If you're ever confused about what quota you have available to you, you can click on the view quota button, and that's going to help you go in and take a look at this, the quota options available for you. So you can see where you're using your quota right now, the amount that you have available. You can configure your quota and request additional quota, so you can actually have these limits raised by contacting support. And you can kind of get a look at it by low priority, dedicated, and clusters as well. So you have that available to you. There's a lot of interesting stuff for managing this stuff. Let's briefly talk about inference clusters and managed and attached compute. Inference clusters is for really if you're using Azure Kubernetes service and you're deploying a lot of stuff out there in a very high level production workflow, that's really what that's for. I don't generally do that, so I have a lot of experience with that, but that's really what inference clusters are all about. And we have attached compute, and this is interesting. This is if you have an existing virtual machine in another part of Azure that you might want to use in machine learning. So you can use your Databricks VM or HD Insight cluster, or a number of other different types of things. You can actually attach them as a compute. You're already provisioned them in Azure, but now you're using them for your machine learning experiments. So generally, if you're getting started out, I push you pretty strongly towards compute clusters. The only reason why you might want a compute instance is if you want to use the notebooks feature. Right now, you need to use a compute instance to power those. But that's really about what we have in Azure Machine Learning. There's a lot of options out there, but start out with a compute cluster, make sure the minimum nodes is 0. Maybe start with a low priority cluster and you're going to be okay. These are pretty affordable, but watch your spend as always. And check out my article if you want a full breakdown of all these different things and comparing and contrasting them. But happy machine learning, and let me know if you have any questions.